Hi, welcome to Parrot and Wolf. Today we're going to talk about comparisons in English. Now, we often compare lots of things in everyday life. For example, when we need to compare the quality and price of clothes before we buy them, or perhaps the difficulty of two similar activities we're going to do. The language we need to talk about comparisons is quite simple as long as you know the basics. And like everything, practice makes perfect. Now, there are three types of comparison: up, equal, and down. Let's look at up comparisons first. A is big and B is big. A is bigger than B. This simple sentence shows the comparison between A and B. The adjective big changes to show the comparison. The form is adjective plus than, and the adjective is in the comparison form, so we have A is bigger than B. Nice and easy. Now what about this? A is bigger than B, B is bigger than C, A is the biggest. This simple sentence shows the comparison between A, B and C. The adjective big changes to show the comparison and which one is at the top. The form is the plus adjective, and the adjective is in the top form, so we have A is the biggest. The adjective form goes like this: big, bigger, biggest. Okay, so that's up comparisons. I told you it was easy, didn't I? Now what about equal comparisons? D is as big as E. This simple sentence shows the comparison between D and E. The adjective big stays the same to show the comparison. The form is as plus adjective plus as, and the adjective is in the normal form, so we have D is as big as E. The negative form is also important here. B is not as big as A. This simple sentence shows the negative equal comparison between A and B. This means they are not equal and there's a difference. Please note, in almost all situations, this negative form is used instead of the less plus adjective for one-syllable adjectives. We'll see more on that next. So that's equal comparisons. Now let's look at down comparisons. B is less big than A. This simple sentence shows the comparison between A and B. The adjective big doesn't change to show the comparison. The form is less plus adjective plus than, and the adjective is in the normal form. So we have B is less big than A. However, we almost never use this form for one-syllable adjectives when speaking and writing informally. We use the negative equal comparison instead. So we would use B is not as big as A. Always try to use this form instead. And that's it. Finished. Well, of course, it's not finished because there are exceptions to these simple rules depending on the size of the adjective. Yes, I know. Or more specifically, how many syllables the adjective has. Now let's have a look. John is taller than David. When the adjective has one syllable, like hot, tall, or cheap, the form is the simple one we've seen. Tall, taller, tallest. All one-syllable adjectives use this form, but be careful because the ending can be tricky. Other examples are cold, colder, coldest, hot, hotter, hottest, large, larger, largest. Notice the ending sometimes needs more or less letters. Okay, so what about adjectives with more than one syllable? John is more interesting than David. When the adjective has three syllables or more, like difficult, intelligent, or expensive, the form changes. It's interesting, more interesting, most interesting, or interesting, less interesting, least interesting. All three-syllable adjectives use this form. Other examples are important, more important, most important, and difficult, less difficult, least difficult. It's the same every time. Now what about two syllables? Well, John is happier than David. John is less boring than David. When the adjective has two syllables, it can be either. The form depends on the specific adjective. The basic rule is, when it ends in Y or O, it's the same as the one-syllable form. All others are the same as the three-syllable form. Other examples are, John is less busy than David, the alley is narrower than the street, Emma is more thoughtful than Ian, David is less pleasant than Jane. Now, there are some irregular but important adjectives that change in a different way. So let's have a look. John is good at tennis, David is better at tennis. The form is the same for irregular adjectives, but the change is different. The other irregular adjectives are good, better, best, bad, worse, worst, far, further, furthest. So what about the size of the difference? A building is 10 meters tall and a person is only 1.5 meters tall. How do we show the size of the difference? Well, let's see. The building is much taller than John. The word much shows that there is a very big difference between the building and John. We can also use a lot and far, and colloquially we can use way and loads. For example, a cat is a lot worse than a dog. Baseball is far more interesting than cricket. Diamonds are way more expensive than wood. And Brazil is loads hotter than Iceland. The last two examples are very colloquial and actually they're grammatically incorrect, but you will hear them often. So what about when there's a very small difference? Well, a basketball is slightly bigger than a football. The word slightly shows that there is a very small difference between the basketball and the football. We can also use a bit and a little. For example, chemistry is a bit more interesting than physics, and a bike is a little quicker than a bus. We can use the equal comparison as well. Ice cream is almost as tasty as chocolate. The word almost shows ice cream and chocolate are very close, but not quite the same. We can also use nearly and not quite. Emma is nearly as good as David at tennis, and fishing is not quite as interesting as politics. That's it. That's all you need to know about comparisons. Finished. Of course, there are some exceptions and special situations for comparisons, but don't concentrate on the small details yet. The best thing you can do is get the simple rules in this lesson correct first, and then build on them as you learn in the future. So, to summarize, we can use adjectives to compare things. The adjective syllables affect the comparison form. We almost never use less with one-syllable adjectives, and you can change the size of the comparison. To find out more about learning English for Cambridge and IELTS exams, business and work, or general conversation, visit ParrotandWolf.com.